Hello and welcome to this conversation on the COVID-19 crisis and restrictions on religious gatherings, hosted by the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University. I'm Michael Kessler, Managing Director of the Center and a faculty member in the Government Department and the Law School. I'm joined today by colleagues from around the country who are esteemed legal scholars. More detailed biographies are on the website event page. I'm joined by Thomas Berg, James L. Oberstar Professor of Law and Public Policy at the University of St. Thomas Law School, Marty Lederman, Professor at the Georgetown University Law Center, Azmauddin, a religious liberty lawyer and scholar working across a variety of contexts for the protection of religious expression for people of all faiths, and Robin Fretwell Wilson, the Roger and Stephany Joslin Professor of Law at the University of Illinois College of Law, and the Director of the Institute of Government and Public Affairs for the University of Illinois System. As we all know, the COVID-19 nightmare unfolded in early 2020, grinding global travel to a halt, wreaking havoc on local and global economies, and causing untold suffering, pain, and death. As of early May 2020, the United States is still in the midst of a total ascent of confirmed cases and death rates. In March and April, a range of city and state leaders issued closure orders for various types of non-essential businesses, sought to limit gatherings of various sizes, and issued stay-at-home orders with specific restrictions on religious services as well as other gatherings of persons, including sports and concert venues. Many saw these orders as crucial ways to mitigate the spread of the virus among persons, while some saw these restrictions as overly burdensome on religious persons, particularly as they restricted religious worship, religious funerals and wedding ceremonies, and other religious community gatherings. The restrictions on in-person gathering size seem to be exactly the type of compelling state interest that has long been thought to be justifiable as a basis for limiting certain kinds of activities that might create a kind of harm. There are many issues that arise in these conversations. What is the status of stay-at-home orders given constitutional cases protecting religious liberty and the federal and state level Religious Freedom Restoration Acts? Have some of the workarounds been feasible to manage around the restrictions, such as drive-in worship services? The mosque in Syracuse, New York, for instance, that created a negative pressure room and limited prayers for 10 people or less. Have there been disparate impacts on different types of religious communities, particularly around religious burial practices? Are there ways within the law and beyond the law to encourage religious communities to cooperate with stay-at-home orders? We'll start by asking each participant to give a few minutes of an overview of the state of the issues from their perspective. And then we'll turn to a general conversation about the range of issues that are raised. So first I'll ask Asma if you begin.
Great. Well, thank you, Michael, for putting this together. I'll start us off generally with the lay of the land. Speaking today about a handful of lawsuits in a few states, in part because most stay-at-home orders have carved out exemptions for religious gatherings. In some cases, states have deemed religious worship essential in the same category as food shopping and healthcare. These states include Florida, South Carolina, and Tennessee, among others. You found that roughly a third of states are allowing religious gatherings to continue without any limit on their size. And 22 states in the District of Columbia have specified in their orders that religious gatherings can take place, but only if they're limited to 10 people or less. Of course, regardless of whether a government restriction is shutting them down, most religious organizations have seized in-person gatherings and have mostly moved online. And on the other end of the spectrum, we've seen some seemingly irrational cases of resistance. For example, Tony Spell from the Oneness Pentecostal congregation brought together 300 people after the stay-at-home order had been issued. And a piece in Salon documents 30 evangelical pastors who have died in the pandemic because they chose to defy social distancing rules and did not limit public gatherings in their churches. The cases that we're talking about today aren't ones where pastors are bringing together hundreds of people and saying the virus itself is just a political ploy. Instead, the churches in these lawsuits agree that a shutdown, social distancing, and other guidelines are necessary to serve a compelling government interest. But they're worried that the restrictions treat religious gatherings unfairly. In one case in Louisville, the mayor said that he would have police record license plates of all vehicles in attendance at a drive-in church service, even as he permitted people to drive through a liquor store's pickup window, park in a liquor store's parking lot, and even go inside to do their shopping. The mayor decided the risk of spreading the virus is worth it when it comes to purchasing liquor, but not worth it for religious gatherings. Judge Walker rejected this and said, if beer is essential, so is Easter. Walker's point goes to this idea that the Louisville mayor doesn't understand the importance of religion, even in relation to beer. I think the other Kentucky case brought by the Maryville Church raises really interesting points about religion as an essential part of people's lives. The terminology there is telling. The ordinance restricts gatherings and makes an exception for so-called life-sustaining organizations, which is defined as any organization that allows Kentuckians to remain healthy at home. It includes newspapers, television, radio, and other media services, law firms, accounting services, real estate companies, liquor stores, and hardware stores. Religious organizations are allowed to continue operating only to the extent that they're providing physical aid, like food, shelter, and social services. So even the activities of religious organizations have essentially been divided into life-sustaining and non-life-sustaining, and the spiritual services they offer have been placed in the latter category. And that really gets to the issue of essentialness and who gets to decide. Rusty Reno, the editor of First Things, wrote early on in the shutdown period that churches should not shut down because, quote, closing churches and canceling services betrays the duty of spiritual care. And I saw a version of my Facebook page when I posted an article about that mosque that you were talking about, Michael, in New York. This it's called Jesus, Son of Mary Mosque. It's a former Catholic church. And they took some interesting steps to help keep the mosque open for 10 or fewer worshipers. So one of the congregants, Irfan Elahi, is an asbestos abatement expert, and he used his skills to create a prayer room covered in plastic with special ventilation. The article says, the room is lined with plastic and two machines siphon air out of the room to create negative pressure. Air in the room is recycled every 4 minutes. Elahi used the materials and expertise from his day job to create what he called a clean room. And volunteers disinfect their room after each prayer, and the room gets a deep cleaning after the last prayer around 9:45 p.m. Elahi said mosque leaders were worried that Muslims in the neighborhood, many of whom are refugees who speak limited English, would panic if their daily prayers were canceled. Their first impulse in times of crisis is to visit the mosque more and pray harder. Now, I can't assess the science of this approach and tell you that, what the risk is of 10 or fewer socially distanced people in a clean room looks like, but I found it really touching and honestly profound that Elahi in this mosque went to such lengths to serve the needs of these frightened refugees who are in desperate need of spiritual solace. And so I was a little taken aback that everyone commenting on the article on my Facebook page was attacking the mosque for even trying this. People said that they were disappointed in Elahi and that educating refugees about the virus is better than trying to cater to their worries and so on. But I don't think anyone is disputing that education is important. The mosque is just trying to serve this deep spiritual need that people have to commune with God in holy spaces, especially at a frightening time like this. And I think that's what's going on in many of these challenges we're seeing, a disconnect between people who get that and people who don't. Now, none of this is to say that there isn't a strong political element here. The Trump administration has set itself up from the beginning of Trump's term as a defender of religion and religious freedom, especially for conservative Christians. Trump appointee Judge Justin Walker used very strong dramatic language in his opinion when he said, quote, on Holy Thursday, an American mayor criminalized the communal celebration of Easter. And Attorney General Bill Barr has also issued strong words saying that, quote, in recent years, an expanding government has made the free exercise clause more important than ever. And then he went on to cite a bunch of recent cases that were all brought by conservative Christians and were heavily politicized in the national discourse. Meanwhile, Trump is retweeting a well-known anti-Muslim activist, Paul Sperry, who implied that government officials wouldn't enforce mosque closures during Ramadan. Trump even defended his retweet during a coronavirus task force briefing, saying that Democrats favor Muslims and persecute Christians. It's not surprising then that some mosques are refusing to even consider small socially distanced gatherings in places where this is not outlawed because they're afraid of Islamophobic backlash. So again, we see government actors swooping in to save the day for churches, and then right next to it, there's a cynical language about mosques. On the flip side, I think some of the language coming out of progressive groups is a bit strange too. A recent Center for American Progress piece said that state bans with religious exemptions are, quote, discriminatory. It says viruses do not discriminate and neither should America's public health response. There's no scientific basis to distinguish between religious gatherings and non-religious gatherings. But this is another way of saying, it seems to me, that religious gatherings aren't essential or life-sustaining. And using the word discriminatory, the center weaves in the now common language of religious freedom used in cases like Little Sisters of the Poor and others are mere covers for discrimination. It says the challenges to stay-at-home orders are being brought by, quote, the Becket Fund for Religious Liberty, Alliance Defending Freedom, and Liberty Council, the same advocacy groups that have been twisting religious freedom into a license to attack vulnerable populations for years before the pandemic. The Trump administration has consistently advanced this distorted view of religious freedom, and there's every indication that it is using the pandemic to further this policy agenda. So that's what the Center for American Progress piece reads, and it seems to me like the same politicization that has plagued religious freedom in recent years is continuing to do so even now. Thank you.
Great. Tom.
Good to be here with everybody. Public health, especially in an emergency, is generally a compelling state interest, perhaps the epitome of such an interest. And in-person worship services do raise serious concerns. Several have been documented as so-called super spreaders of COVID transmission. But bans on communal worship, as Ozma said, especially if they last several months, also seriously restrict the fundamental right of exercising religion. The First Amendment protects free exercise because it's very important to believers. And it's important to them in crises like this as a source of strength and comfort. So therefore, it's entirely appropriate, I think, to scrutinize an order that extends to banning in-person worship and ask whether it does allow a significant number of other activities that present similar risks. So if the order does that, then that tends to undercut the claim that the worship ban is necessary to serve a compelling interest. And in about 30 states, that is the standard that the government must meet in order to restrict religious freedom. Whether the law is generally applicable or not, it has to satisfy the compelling interest standard. Exempting a lot of other activities that present similar risks could also show, even in other states where general applicability is the standard, it could show that the order is not generally applicable and devalues religion compared to those activities. But now, even under that framework, where orders are scrutinized carefully, I do think that the courts have been quite right so far to uphold restrictions on in-person worship in most cases. But several courts have also said quite sensibly that drive-in services in the parking lot cannot be banned. So let's talk about why that both of those seem sensible to me, at least. So most of the orders restricting in-person worship place it in a category with mass gatherings like concerts, theater, or sporting events, as Michael said. On the other hand, those orders typically allow a wide range of so-called essential services like grocery shopping, food takeout, banks, healthcare, liquor stores, also law firms, accountants' offices, and quite a lot of others. So does allowing those mean that in-person worship has to be allowed as well? Deciding that requires looking at the public health reasons for including in-person worship in the restricted category. And there are several reasons for that. First, worship can bring together large numbers of people in crowded settings. Now, so can large supermarkets standing in line. But the second point is that people spend longer in a worship service, often sitting in one place in close proximity, accumulating and worsening infections. Worship can also encourage hugs and other intimacy that can be difficult to police and stop. And if that weren't enough, to top it off, singing seems to propel droplets further. So choirs present a particular problem, it appears. So together, I think these features do create a powerful case for restricting in-person worship, at least at this stage. But it is unfortunate that the orders, as Ozma observes, employ the categories of essential versus non-essential activities. Now, that may be a category that stems from what the discretion or the standards that the governor is allowed to rely on in promulgating an order, but it ought to be clarified. Even if governor has to use those words, because that distinction leaves the impression that the orders are saying that religion is relatively unimportant. And as Ozma observes, that has angered people, and I think that there's a basis for that kind of reaction. If in-person worship is like a sporting event, it's not because they are both non-essential entertainment. It's because they share features that present elevated risks of transmission. And we ought to be clear about that. But those risks from crowded personal mixing don't arise with other worship type events like a drive-in service broadcast to cars in the parking lot. After some early missteps, several orders have been clarified to allow that. Although other orders that are out there remain unclear on this point. And several judicial opinions have sensibly distinguished drive-in from in-person gatherings. I'll look forward to talking about the kind of cultural and political aspects that Ozma has brought up. I didn't raise them in my initial remarks here, but I'd love to talk about them. Let me just conclude that this is a moving target, right? Because as states open up their economies, allowing more activities, justifying total bans on in-person worship may become more difficult. For example, once people are permitted to sit in restaurants for potentially a couple of hours, subject to social distancing limits, yes, but all those can also be present in church or in worship. Why can't people sit in worship services for 2 hours as well? I mean, restaurants unquestionably present risks. People sit around the table. They have to remove their masks in order to eat. They use plates that are touched by servers. And they may have extra reason in a restaurant to touch their face. So there are definitely risks there. Now, admittedly, it may be that no governor is out there who's going to open up restaurants on a widespread basis and keep churches closed. That's not where our political dynamics are. But issues like that will arise, I think, as long as once more activities are allowed. But then what if cases spike and sheltering orders return? So these issues, like the virus itself, will recur in waves and in potentially changing forms for many months. Thanks.
Thank you, Tom. Robin, you're next.
Well, this will be worse for Marty when he talks, but being third is hard because a lot of points that you wanted to make, Ozma drilled and so did Tom. But so let me make a couple of observations rather than to repeat some of that. One, I think Tom is right that we're going to see a pivot to reopening, whether it's justified as a public health matter or not. The pressure is just building so great on people. That it's going to be difficult to forestall that. I think what that means then is that these decisions are going to go from being at the state level to sort of suddenly being at the lower levels of government. And the same questions are going to be there for those mayors and city councils and local governments, which is what will they do in a more confined geographic area. So I think we want to have a rich discussion about this because lots of people without very big professional staffs like the governors have are going to very soon be dealing with this question in their own communities. So that's like a first starting point. It's not going to go away as soon as we reopen. It's just going to get scattered down. And I think that's important. So I think it's important to go back and hearken on something that Tom did mention and Ozma too. you know, the state has ability with a general rule of neutral applicability to disproportionately burden religious belief, even under the free exercise clause and under the Smith decision. Now, that's good law. Maybe that will change. We don't know. There are cases before the Supreme Court where people see that as a possibility. I don't know. But right now, that is, in fact, the law. And the governors who are acting for the general welfare right now are acting under another Supreme Court case, Jacobson, which gives the state incredible power to encroach on individual liberty. In the Jacobson case itself, still good law, you know, they compelled a man who did not want to be vaccinated to be vaccinated. And let's think about that for a second. The vaccine not only protects him individually, but it's directly relevant to the health and well-being of that society. So that power is there. I think that's without question. Now, where you get to the real rub is the point that Asma and Tom both made in different ways, which is it seems sort of ridiculous to call like a real estate closing essential and then say you can't go to worship, right? If you're going to be willing to take risks in one place, given these massive number of carve-outs that some jurisdictions have allowed for gatherings for all kinds of reasons, it seems like you ought to do that potentially for worship as well. Now, the difficulty, I think, then becomes a question of whether those carve-outs were right in the first place. Did we exempt too many things? And here I want to talk about some of the instances that Asma just mentioned about worship. So I, in this new role that I have leading the Institute of Government and Public Affairs at the University of Illinois System, we've created a task force to look at COVID-19's impact on the state of Illinois. And one of the task forces is about the healthcare workforce itself, okay? So I spend 2 mornings a week now with epidemiologists. And let me tell you a few things that I've learned. One, COVID-19 lasts for 3 days on cardboard. So think about this. If you have somebody who is actually respiring at a worship service, maybe because, as Tom says, they're singing along with the choir, and they're reading from the hymnal, that's paper. That's there for 3 days. Look at plastic, metal, and glass. In other words, every sort of, you know, place that you're going to pass in a house of worship. The COVID-19 lasts 9 days on those surfaces. Now, you might say people will actually sort of self-restrict. In other words, you know, maybe there'll be these folks who will say to themselves, wow, I don't want to take my mother because my mother, in my particular case, and that puts her in, you know, a very, very high risk category for being affected by COVID-19. Now, we also know that faith really shores up lots of people who find themselves lonely right now and stranded and without community. So you might be inclined to take your mother. But the possibility for somebody like that of becoming gravely ill because they were trying to be shored up by faith, I think is a really, really incredible one. So to see this politicized, to see people say, wow, you know, faith is so essential in people's lives that, damn it, we don't want these churches to be shut, I think is deeply irresponsible given the demographics of many people who go to church. They're older people like my mother. And on this point, you could say, well, maybe then Robin will go and leave her mother at home. And one of the things I learned on my epidemiology call yesterday is that in China, they believe that most of the transmission was actually in household transmission. Now, there are papers that talk about that. I don't know if they're right or not. But pause and say to yourself, if I go to services, but then I go back home to my mother, what if I carried home to her? And I think these are really, really profound questions. Now, there's a part of this that I think we haven't really talked about, which is what the liability for people who are bringing people into these spaces is. If you could, in fact, show that the cluster started at a church, and Asma talked about 30 faith leaders and so forth who have died, there's actually a very good argument that some of these clusters, in fact, have started at churches. Then what's the liability for them? Now, one of the things that Illinois did in its executive order is it suspended the liability of healthcare facilities for the transmission of COVID-19. Just did it. Now, I don't know. There'll probably be lawsuits about that too. Who knows whether that will actually hold up. But unless these these places of religious worship have that same protection, I think it's very dicey for them to be inviting people into a space that they can't be sure that they've actually cleaned and that they can protect people from that public health risk. Now, this isn't an argument about the law in the sense of, do you have the prerogative under the law? Do you have a right under the First Amendment to do it? It's an argument that it may not be the right thing to do. It's probably not loving. If you can't be positive, people who are coming to your faith service are going to be able to go back home and be safe after being sustained by faith. I don't know why you would gamble with that until we know more. So I'll end on that point.
Great, Marty.
Yeah, thanks, Michael and Berkley Center for doing this. This is wonderful. It's an honor and fun to be with all of you. We don't get to see one another at all these days, so we'll do it virtually. So Michael asked me to talk a little bit about the law, and so I'll do a quick minute or two and make it as simplified, perhaps overly simplistic as I can, and then address some of the things my co-panelists have talked about in terms of what's actually happening in the states, which is much less than I think meets the eye or has been sort of cooked up or advertised. So the law, quite simply, can raise two different kinds of, the constitutional law can raise two different kinds of problems, both of which involve discrimination with respect to religion. So on the one hand, if religion and religious exercise, and important religious exercises like communal worship, are discriminated against, are singled out for disparate treatment, deliberately or perhaps even in some cases systematically or structurally, that can raise heightened scrutiny, which is difficult to meet and might be struck down on free exercise grounds. Now, I don't think anyone here is claiming that there's been any except for Judge Walker and his preposterous screed, no one is claiming that there's any actual animus against religion here. So then the real question on that score would be, is religion being singled out vis-a-vis analogous other functions and being treated worse? And if so, is that justifiable? Now, as Michael pointed out, and I think Asma did as well, under the Jacobson case, which is more than a century ago, it might mean that in an emergency like this, the courts will be deferential, even if there is such a singling out. But I don't think so. Let's just talk about ordinary law, not emergency law. So if religion is discriminated against, there might be a serious free exercise claim. On the other hand, if discrimination is singled out for special treatment, and Asma mentioned that several of these orders in several states actually treats churches better than what I will in a minute call analogous other institutions or functions, that can raise two other kinds of serious constitutional questions. First, to the extent that it's a preference with respect to religious expression, and religious worship and religious sermonizing and religious gatherings typically involve expression or assembly, that other expressive or assembly type functions do not get, that can raise serious First Amendment concerns under the Free Speech Clause and the Freedom of Assembly Clause. Religious speech cannot be preferred. Religious expression cannot be preferred to analogous non-religious expression. And secondly, when religious accommodations are often permissible, that is to say, governments can give religious exemptions to generally applicable laws under certain circumstances to alleviate significant burdens that the government has imposed on religious exercise. But where it imposes severe harms on third parties, and the court hasn't drawn the line yet as to exactly how much, it can raise a serious Establishment Clause question. So I'll just give a very, very easy example of that, which is if a state were ever to grant a religious exemption to the laws requiring parents to give life-saving medical treatment to their children, I'm sure the courts would strike that down as an Establishment Clause violation. And quite frankly, laws that around the country that allow religious objections but not non-religious objections to immunization requirements raise very serious Establishment Clause questions because the harms to the community are quite extensive in those cases. So those are the problems if religion is favored. So what's been going on? The main thing I'd like to press is that I don't think there's been some discrimination in favor of religion, as Ozma points out. And I am worried, wholly apart from the Establishment Clause and Free Speech Clause perspective, that is potentially doing an enormous amount of harm. That it is, as Tom and Ozma and Robin have all emphasized, churches are one place in which the virus has been spreading, and it goes into families immediately. And that's for obvious reasons, and they're the ones that you guys have already discussed, right? You're sharing hymnals, you're sharing pews, you're sharing restrooms with all that entails. And so churches, like other places where people gather for long, prolonged periods of time, are nursing homes, bars, gymnasiums. These have been the places that have been the primary vectors of the virus. And to allow churches to open with the harm to the community that might result would raise, to my mind, a serious Establishment Clause question, but of course a much more serious public health problem. All right, so what's going on? I think the headlines, the cases we're hearing about, and the challenges on behalf of religious liberty are very, very rare and idiosyncratic exceptions, challenging laws that don't actually discriminate against religion. The most important fact, I believe, and this is something that the governors and mayors and other officials in Kentucky and Virginia and Illinois and all these other states have emphasized, is that 99+% of religious congregations and religious leaders have been very willing to abide by the restrictions. In fact, they're eager to do so for the same reasons we do. Universities are shutting down. We are not meeting together. We're on Zoom. The same reason most restaurants and most bars and most concert halls and most clubs are not complaining. They're not going into court and saying this violates our free speech rights or our free assembly rights, or even mostly not other forms of rights like Second Amendment rights. There's a recent Boston case in which a gun shop got an injunction against their closing down. So I think for the most part, there's no real objection to what's been going on in these states. But there have been a handful of cases, and I hate to contradict Ozma here, but I think that her characterization of what's going on in Kentucky and Virginia, for instance, is not correct. So churches are not being singled out. These state governors have pretty much, not in precise ways that legislatures can after a lot of debate, but in very extreme circumstances, in very short order, have issued orders, or their agencies have, that generally speaking prohibit all mass gatherings, period, no exceptions at all. And what they mean by that, and this is really fleshed out in a brief filed yesterday by the Virginia governor in an Eastern District of Virginia case, that DOJ is going in and saying there's a free exercise problem. There's a category mistake here. That the place where the virus is most problematic, it's not unproblematic in places where people pass one another, and like grocery stores and the like, which are not that populated these days. It's in these places where there is, and it appears that the contact tracing tests in other countries are demonstrating that it's in places where people have close and prolonged contact with others and share these, as Robin was describing, these physical surfaces with others over long periods of time. Those are the problematic contexts. And there, these states are prohibiting all mass gatherings, no exceptions at all. So where does this idea come in about essential services? Well, the states are also imposing shutdown rules, even apart from mass gatherings, on most retail and service establishments. And on that second restriction, they have some exceptions for what they call essential services, but not for mass gathering. You can't have mass gatherings in these places. You can just engage in essential services, which are roughly speaking defined as the things that people need to, not perfectly under every order, but things that people need to subsist to make the problem less acute, right? Without food, without the sort of basic needs of household, people will be going out and doing things in other ways that would threaten to spread the virus more. But there is no permission for mass gathering in those contexts either. And so for the most part, churches some of the churches can provide services, and many of the churches are open for business in a way, but they can't have mass gatherings because no one can. And so this idea that there's a discrimination against these mass gatherings, or worse yet, that Governor Beshear and Mayor Fisher of Louisville are hostile toward religion and don't understand its value. I have to say, Asma, with all respect, that is, if you watch any one press conference of any of these officials, the sensitivity to religious liberty and religious needs is extraordinary, and they are bending over backwards to express their desire to assist people and to accommodate people to be able to practice their religion. This is the furthest thing from hostility toward religion. And in fact, they say over and over again, in Mayor Fisher's case, because he's a quite religious man, that he thinks religion, and even communal religion, is absolutely essential to people's lives. But so is education, and so is music, and so are bookstores, and so are many other things in which mass gatherings are not permissible. That's the point. Most of the things valued in the Constitution, in the First Amendment, are prohibited. Most gatherings of collections of people to engage in those activities are unfortunately prohibited right now, and we are all suffering for it. Which leaves one other matter, which I guess we can get into if you desire, and that's this false issue of drive-up services. So there is no prohibition on drive-up services in Kentucky or anywhere else that I'm aware of. This was made up out of whole cloth, despite the officials saying that it was not. There were no such prohibitions. And to give an example, this Sixth Circuit opinion that Asma mentions that was issued last week, the challenge was not predominantly to a prohibition on drive-up services. And the governor there filed a brief saying, we don't prohibit drive-up services. The prohibition there that they wanted to get in was they wanted to engage in church services, this church. And they were being prohibited from doing so on Easter. And the photographs in the briefs are of people embracing and being with one another and gathering with one another for in-church services. The Sixth Circuit just made up out of, excuse the expression, whole cloth, this prohibition on drive-up services, and then enjoined it, even though there is no such prohibition. So I think that they've actually bent over backwards to say, yes, this is one way you can have a collective religious gathering. Drive up in your cars, follow the following 4 or 5 different distancing rules within those cars, don't touch one another, and the like, and we'll allow you to do that. So there are a lot of things we can discuss and debate about these lawsuits, but I think the main thing to take away, the main thing I want to impress upon the viewers here is that A, the public officials have been exceedingly sensitive to and accommodating of religious exercise, and B, that the vast, vast majority of religious communities and leaders have agreed that these mass gatherings are very, very dangerous and are not seeking to get exemptions from them.
Well, thanks to each of you, and we'll really take these this range of issues in turn, and anybody can follow up. I want to follow up about something that I'm seeing as a thread across here, which is that on the one hand, it seems that the more generally applicable a restriction is, and the more over-inclusive it is in terms of not carving out any exemptions for anyone, that seems to stand better than orders like the order that initially happened in Kansas when Governor Kelly issued a ban that was revised that limited religious gatherings to 10 people or fewer, but had a number of carve-outs for things like shopping malls where it was assumed, quote, that large numbers of people are present, but not generally within arm's length of one another, libraries, other kinds of manufacturing facilities. And then of course the legislative committee rescinded that order, and it was also subject to a challenge in a federal district court and was overturned or ruled against later in April. That the problem there seemed to be that it was under-inclusive because it restricted the religious gathering, but it allowed for lots of other things that look like the same kind of religious gathering that you're talking about, Marty, which seems to suggest that when you have those kinds of not blanket restrictions on gatherings, but some kinds of gatherings can happen and others can't. If religious gatherings are specifically restricted, that creates a much heightened demand for scrutiny in the way that Tom and others were talking about. Is that the case? And it would then the way forward for a number of these things for states, if you were advising states, it seems like it would be really important to be as broad and focused on the actual gathering of people as the thing that needs to be prevented.
I seem to have been, you seem to have been directing me. I'm not aware of any such cases, Michael, where actual gatherings, as opposed to places like shopping centers where there are many people at one time, but that don't raise remotely the same risks because of what we've discussed in terms of the sharing of facilities and surfaces and the like, and they're passing by one another. The states that I'm aware of, I'm not as familiar with Kansas, are categorical bans on mass gatherings everywhere. That is to say, people coming together as a group to do things. I will mention that one of the states, it might be Kentucky, you mentioned libraries, and there was one order that left libraries open, which I think is very rare. All the libraries around here are certainly closed. I don't see why libraries have been exempted somewhere, but it raises an interesting question. Interesting legal question. Robin's hypo, which I agree, Robin, I don't think is going to happen. I don't think there's a community that's going to start saying restaurants are fine, but churches aren't. They'll be treated the same. If not, churches won't be treated better. But if there's one exemption that can't be explained that really is analogous, libraries, let's say, does that mean churches have to be treated the same as libraries? Or does that mean churches can still be treated the same as, just to give the list in the Kentucky law, community, civic, public, leisure, faith-based, educational, sporting events, parades, concerts, festivals, conventions, fundraisers, and similar activities? Does one carve-out, let's say there's a library carve-out that causes the same risks, mean that churches have to be treated the same as the one rather than the same as the 99? I think the law says no, that that one carve-out is not enough, but it does at least raise an interesting question.
So Marty, why is the category of quote unquote mass gatherings versus businesses, retail, why is that a sacrosanct category? I mean, as Michael points out, there are plenty of businesses that can raise the same kind of problems about people using a facility over and over again or touching the same surface. And it's not only mass gatherings that do that. Think about meat processing plants, right? And other, lots of other businesses that have been kept open under the essential provisions order. So I guess that's my question to you, is why just the mere distinction between mass gatherings and retail, that doesn't necessarily fit with what the public health reasons are.
So my understanding, and I'm not an epidemiologist, is that, as Virginia points out, there are two separate prohibitions. All mass gatherings are prohibited in most of these states, and most, but not all, retail establishments.
I understand that they've treated them as two different things, and that may be relevant to, under the Smith standard. But if we're asking about public health reasons, why are those categories black and white?
They're separate prohibitions, and there are exceptions to the one. But my understanding, Tom, and here I'm way out of my my wheelhouse, is that the spread of the virus has been much more severe in places where people are gathering together communally, not just churches, but all these other places, as opposed to passing one another. I happen to think it's probably a lot to do with the use of restrooms and use of common materials and the like.
Meat packing plants, Navy ships, lots of other places.
Navy ships are a big problem. So are nursing homes. And if there were something we could do with everyone in nursing homes, I'm sure we would.
Yeah. It's just not only mass gatherings, though, that present the problems.
But Tom, you're listing the places where the virus has been spreading most acutely. Why would you add to that?
Okay, so can I jump in on this, a little exchange? And I'm sure Asma would like to at some point too, but Is that okay, Michael? Okay. So look, you know, I agree with you, Marty, that there is this idea that we could equalize down, right? That we could actually take more things and say those are places that we can't gather. And, you know, as long as we're treating houses of worship like every other place that we now restrict, you know, that should fly, okay? And I don't think Tom is disagreeing with that. And I think Asma might. She might say that there's something about worship that's, you know, shouldn't be restricted notwithstanding. But I think this is a lot harder for the policymakers that I'm talking to. So we did a document at the Institute of Government and Public Affairs that talks about how you should think about reopening the economy, okay? And this goes to the shopping center versus the church. The church is not going to be a locus or an engine of like economic, you know, comeback, but the shopping center might. And I could understand why, you know, governors or policymakers might try to say, okay, all mass gatherings, they're like over here, they're one kind of thing. But then there are these economic levers, frankly, and engines, and we're going to treat them differently. Now, I don't know whether that would not be a neutral rule of general applicability. You have different reasons for wanting to, or for different reasons for being willing to accept the public health risk at the shopping. And maybe there's actually a different public health case to be made about the risk at the shopping center than there is to be made about the churches. But I think the analysis is really, at least for the policymakers, I think much more complicated when they're talking about places that are places of commerce. And one of the things that we've tried to do in thinking about the public health risk is to connect the lack of economic opportunity to public health itself. In other words, people have delayed health care. People are losing their insurance. They're losing their jobs. They have tremendous mental strain. We don't even have to think about this as economic risk versus public health risk. We can look at it as a basket of public health risks. And they're trying to minimize the total harm. And part of that, I think, will be if we take this risk of gathering and transmitting COVID-19, are we mitigating some other piece of this basket of risk, i.e., are we bringing the economy back online? Now, you could say the same thing about churches, that they're bringing the economy back online. And there's certainly pastors that I think are probably facing existential crises because they don't have donations. I mean, for all I know, these churches live paycheck to paycheck like most Americans. So you might be concerned about these entities in terms of their own viability. In any event, I do think there are reasons to make distinctions. I think if they're done categorically, you know, they may survive. I don't know.
So I just wanted to say a couple of things in response to some of the comments, but mostly Marty. So first, just wanted to clarify that I'm not by any means sort of taking on the precise rhetoric that I had called out, which is like this idea of, you know, these governors waging a war against religion. It's nothing that dramatic. For me, it's really just about this idea, trying to tease out this idea of the sort of specialness of religion, right? What is unique about it, and what is like the sort of really deep, sort of profound spiritual role that it plays that's different from other types of expression, that perhaps maybe some of the disagreement is sort of based on an inability maybe to be on the same page about that. Regarding some of the discussion that we're having here about what's exempted and what's not, just wanted to point out that in the Kansas case, bars and restaurants were exempted and churches were not. And so in that case, that is an instance where restaurants, which is, you know, pose, as Tom pointed out, more risks than probably religious gatherings, were allowed to stay open. And the Maryville case, both shopping malls, which Robin brought up some of the risks there, but that was the one where libraries were allowed to stay open. And I think it's a fair point, in terms of creating these distinctions based on places that create an elevated risk versus those that don't. But what I've been seeing in the arguments in these cases is that these churches are saying, well, we'll follow all the rules. We're not denying that these rules are important. Just give us a set of rules, you know, and so far the CDC has provided those, and we're willing to comply with that. And why is it that if we're willing to comply with these rules and create the same level of risk that other places that are allowed to stay open are creating. Why aren't we allowed to do that, right? So there's like this situation where you have a church that can accommodate like 1,000 people, and they're saying that, we'll only have, like 30 people in there like that. I think that was the case with the Legacy case, the Legacy Church. And so just, I think that piece of it needs to be acknowledged. In the Sixth Circuit case and the drive-in issue, from what I remember, the Sixth Circuit opinion, they noted that the Kentucky State Police had actually issued notices to the congregants that their attendance at the drive-in was, amounted to a criminal act. So I don't really know what the precise dispute is about that fact. And finally, just a question for the group as a whole is this idea of third-party harms that Marty brought up. I'm sort of interested in teasing that out. And I think, Robin, based on your comments, you were saying, well, it's the people who come and also the people who take it home to vulnerable people in their homes. So that would be, in that sense, third party. But are we thinking about this beyond that as a third party, like society generally, that might get this from people who go to religious houses of worship? And if it's the first two, if it's people going, with whom they're living, it just seems like a complicated way to think about third party, right? Because it's not really third party. It's the people who are voluntarily sort of putting themselves in this position and willing to sort of take on this risk.
I'll just dovetail there for just a second. I mean, everybody, look, we're talking about something that can kill a person like my mother. And I would understand why, at this time where there's so much dislocation and loneliness, that people would run into the arms of faith. I get that completely. But I think I think that there are a lot of people of faith, and you started with a group of folks who, maybe had recently come to the United States, didn't have as much wherewithal, maybe didn't, would not be able to consume some of the public health literature about this. And I think it's deeply irresponsible what some faith leaders have done by telling people that they have a duty, an actual duty, to go to a place that is going to be fraught with so much risk. And I think about these folks who went to these churches, who brought things back to their own families, and just the incredible burden that they must shoulder if somebody in their immediate circle or beyond has gotten sick because of that. I think in many ways, a lot of the Catholic parishes, I think, have got it right. They've said, if you have a duty to be observant, it's to be observant, but not necessarily in this group right now. And I think that faith, like many other things that we value in our lives, and Marty has talked about some of them, I think it's going to have to take a back seat right now, just to be responsible.
Could we dig in a little more to Ozma's, I think, very poignant observation at the beginning about who gets to decide about these questions of what constitutes sort of material aid that is permitted, providing food, providing charitable works, versus the kinds of spiritual care. I'm thinking in particular of some of the impact on burials. Probably we've seen this most visibly with some of the Orthodox communities in New York and New Jersey define the orders about the numbers of people who can gather at religious burials. And I think the argument that's expressed there is that this is so essential to our communal identity, so essential to our practice, that there is no way to do this without this. There's an assumption, in a way, there's an assumption of risk that is also expressed. And is it appropriate for the government at that point to say that you can do this without that whole element of ritual and communal gathering, which when you approach it in that way, bracketing out the public and epidemiological public health problems there, does seem to heighten the impact on religious freedom, and makes one wonder if there's another way to go about making those restrictions, and who gets to make that decision.
Well, look, just even if you take the frame, Michael, of assumption of risk, I don't think it gets us very far, because unless all of those people live completely alone,
right,
right? And don't have aged parents or other people who have comorbidities, somebody who's obese in their family. Unless that's true, they're not assuming that risk only for themselves. That's part one. And part two, if they get sick, if they lived alone and got sick, then they're just unnecessarily falling onto the healthcare system right now, which, you know, we've all been sitting here trying to flatten the curve where, you know, we're taking a mass beating as an economy just to flatten the curve. And then to say, hey, you're fine to go to the funeral as long as you assume that risk, I think just neglects the fact that if those folks are sick, they're showing up exactly in the places that we've been trying, you know, to kind of, you know, broaden out this curve so that it can manage a public health crisis. So I don't think it gets us anywhere. Me personally, I just don't.
I agree with Robin that the public health harms caused by the very understandable desire of religious communities to not be inoculated or to engage in these extremely important religious rituals, such as funerals, a very important community gathering, have been enormous over the years. And it's understandable for the state to prohibit them. Michael, I think funerals is an excellent way of thinking about this as an example, because we can all understand the importance of coming together to grieve and to bury our loved ones, whether it's religious or not religious. And those things are all prohibited or limited to 10 people in most jurisdictions, with enormous impacts on our lives. The fact that people are losing parents is one thing, but the inability to be with them and then to allow their friends and family to grieve with them is one of the cruelest things about this virus. And we all suffer from that. And I think it would be unthinkable, I think, to allow religious but non-religious funerals and gatherings to occur. But you also asked a very interesting, if I can, question about the who decides, not just on religious questions or gathering questions. One really interesting legal thing, I'll just leave this out there because it's not really a Berkeley Center issue that hasn't gotten enough attention yet, is most of these states, the legislatures have delegated an extraordinarily broad degree of discretion to governors and other officials in emergency situations in ways that, as much as the attention we've been having lately on all the emergency authorities Congress has given to the president, pales in comparison. I mean, obviously that's across the whole nation, but the way these statutes are being read by most governors, and they may be correct, they have incredible discretion to just transform the legal framework of their states in an emergency, which is really a fascinating issue. And one really interesting phenomenon I think right now is the approval ratings of these governors in these states, red and blue, are through the roof. And that gets back to my main point, which is that, you know, as important as this issue is that we're discussing, I think the real thing to stress is that there's really a remarkable consensus that these governors are doing not a perfect job. Nobody could do a perfect job, but are really, unlike the federal government, these governors are really trying to do what's right for their communities. And the vast majority of religious and non-religious people are voluntarily going along with those rules, understanding the risks. And so these exceptions, and they are important, and the people are very sincere in raising them, whether they be religious or not. It's not that it's unimportant, but I really think that it can tend to be to be the sort of exception that obscures the general the general applicability of these laws in the way that most people have accepted them.
So I think that the funeral is a problem case for some of the reason that Marty said. There's obviously a very significant religious claim of religious ritual and religious gathering, but death is that point. It's kind of the limit experience for everybody, and to draw hard lines between religious celebration or religious gatherings to mark a death and non-religious ones is, I think, a much more problematic distinction than, say, between the concert and the worship service. So we might read religious freedom statutes or provisions to expand the definition of religion into some forms of conscience or on limit type matters like life and death, and extend it beyond what we normally think of as religious there. But would be a problem to just limit that to religious funerals. But I mean, that does raise the fact that, Marty, you gave a kind of incomplete description of the law here, because you said it's the constitutional law, but in 30 states, either by state constitution or state religious freedom statute, there is scrutiny of what the orders have done, whether or not one can say they've been categorized as mass gatherings versus retail businesses. The fact that it's creates a substantial burden is enough to require some, decent level of justification. And so just that categorization is not going to be enough in most of the states. And, Robin, yes, every single one of these things creates a risk, but, so does going to the laundromat. So does, so I do think that whichever route we go on this, whether it's under a state RFRA or under a proper interpretation of the free exercise clause and general applicability, we are going to have to take a look at these orders and ask whether they are extending the same limitations to other things that create essentially the same public health purposes. Marty, I agree with you that for the most part, the governors have done that well. I think they've clarified themselves in some cases because they got pushback. And so, it's a fight. It's a back and forth, and we hopefully reach some decent solutions, but somebody has to push on Mayor Fisher in Louisville when he says, we're not going to allow drive-in services, which is one of the things he said, right? He said a number of things. He said, I want to encourage you, even if you have the right to do a drive-in service, maybe you shouldn't. But he also said, we're not going to allow it. And so there are ambiguities, and, it takes a while for these things to get worked out. Everybody is kind of, is groping in a bit of the dark to try to get to the right solution. So there's a number of scattered points. I guess I just do think that we can't avoid asking whether religion is being treated as well as other things that the state takes seriously as services that people need.
I would also just sort of jumping off your set of ideas there, Tom, make the observation, because my interest in these law and religion questions is often the sort of broader meta questions about, well, what does that say about the limits of the law? And in the history of this pandemic and the buildup of state reactions, it's going to be interesting to see that most of the initial concerns outside of the CDC and what we find out the intelligence community was doing or learning about this, most of the initial impulses and reactions to the growing pandemic were other kinds of social institutions and religious communities that were saying, and religiously affiliated universities and NASCAR and the NBA and other social institutions that were driving the cultural idea that this is a real problem that we need to get ahead of, while there was political resistance such that the legal institutions themselves were kind of, hampered until other agencies, other institutions kind of took the lead. And then the government has had to backfill that space with a lot of these stay-at-home orders and the like. The lost couple of months where we would have expected the legal apparatus and the political apparatus and the machinery of the government to build out and take these steps and to figure out what would be the right restrictions and stay-at-home orders. and work out some of these issues. They seemingly got done in 2 days after NASCAR decided that they were going to ban mass gatherings. Then the governor seemed to say, we have to make sure that mass gatherings get done. So I only raised that as an interesting, as an observation of an interesting fact about how the law here was not leading, but kind of following from my perspective. Robin and Asma, I think you wanted to also jump in here.
Well, I just wanted to point out, I mean, I agree with what Marty and Tom were saying about the governors doing a great job. But also the fact, as Tom brought up, that there's going to be back and forth, there's going to be pushback. And I think, the fact that Marty pointed out just this incredible breadth of like discretion that's given to governors in a state of emergency. I mean, the New York Times has put out some pieces about how authoritarian governments are using this opportunity now to really sort of consolidate power for themselves. And I think what's really kind of awesome about these cases is that they're showing exactly like what we should be doing. We should be making sure that governments aren't going too far and questioning limitations on our rights. And so I think that's, the upside here.
Well, and I would just say, I don't doubt that some governments are going to overreach, or maybe just were very glib about the value of faith, or, versus any other thing that they were weighing. But I think it is still tragic for this to be that big culture war moment where people are wanting to take this question as much to push back against government power, or to weigh in on whether, we too precipitously move to shutting the economy or not. I just think it ill serves their own communities. And I think the risks are maybe greater than we appreciate for when we come back together. And I just think it would be tragic for people to have hurt their own faith communities, their own families, their own loved ones because of what's become a political, cultural war moment. I just think that's tragic.
So other final thoughts?
Oh, well, I don't want to prolong this if you're wanting to wrap up, Michael.
No, feel free. Jump, stay.
I mean, I guess a couple of things. This has become a culture wars element in the culture wars, like virtually everything else has. But it's also the case that some of the churches that have been meeting, maybe not the churches that have filed lawsuits, but churches that have met, have been, for example, African-American Pentecostal churches. And there is a combination there of, in some cases, pointing out that a large number of members don't have good either internet access or good internet access, so that the online stream church service doesn't work as well. Or there's a kind of, sort of belief in the power of the Holy Spirit. And and that's not, and I understand what you're saying about that, how you can't confine the effects of your decision there solely to yourself. But at the very least, it's not all political, I don't think. Beneath this, there is some deep questions about, what is the relative value of adhering to faith versus risking one's life? And we are facing those kind of questions now in a way that a comfortable 21st century society like ours seldom faces. So I just think it's a little more complicated than people doing this purely for political reasons, although that has definitely happened. And I wanted to mention that other disparate impact here on communities of faith that can't, it's easy for those of us who have used Zoom quite, adjusted to it, and we're all teaching, et cetera, through it. But a lot of folks don't have that kind of access.
I agree. I mean, I think we have a lot of public health education, Tom, to do, but it will be a stain on faith communities if they encourage this as a political, cultural moment. and people end up dying. It'll be a stain on that community.
So I just want to say I agree with both. I think that if they are encouraging that as a political issue, then absolutely it's going to be a stain. But as Tom pointed out, there's so many who are pushing back against these restrictions from a different place, and I think it's complicated. I mean, that's kind of, again, like the Syracuse mosque, right, with the asbestos abatement person covering everything in plastic. He clearly wasn't coming at it from a political place. And I respect the comments on both sides, this idea that it's still creating a health risk. But I think it's just some of the issues are so much deeper.
And I'll just say I'm in violent agreement with all of my co-panelists. Sorry, Michael, I know we're supposed to be trying to, but I couldn't agree more with almost all of what you've said, and just wish and hope and pray that we will be able to engage in a mass gathering of the 5 of us and many others and look back on this and assess it in retrospect sooner rather than later. That would be really nice.
Any
Amen.
other final thoughts?
Amen.
All right, well, thank you very much. And I want to thank each of the panelists for participating, and let us hope that we'll be able to gather soon in person to continue to discuss these issues and look back on this, and as these issues will not go away, even if the virus hopefully does. So thank you very much.